Yo, what's going on everyone? Thank you for tuning in. In this video, we are going to be comparing the Sony A7 III and the Canon EOS R for video shooters. Now, the biggest reason that I am making this video is because a couple weeks ago, I actually posted a video that I'll link right here talking about the fact that I'm selling my A7 III and considering going back to the Canon system. Now, after kind of reflecting on that video a bit, I think I realized that I made that video somewhat caught up in the moment and just gave my opinion without any facts or results or details to back it up. So in this video, we're going to do a detailed review and comparison of these two cameras, and I'm going to compare them in three main areas. First one will be video quality, both 4K and 1080. Then I'm going to talk about the assistive features that each camera provide. And then lastly, maybe most importantly, who are these cameras for? So with all that being said, let's get right into it with the first category of video quality. Now, both of these cameras shoot in 4K at up to 30 frames per second. However, the Canon EOS R does have a 1.7 crop factor when shooting 4K. And so for the video quality test, what I did is my wife and my dog and myself, we went out to a park and just shot some sample clips. And the reason why I did it this way is because I'm sure we've all seen the reviews out there of two cameras, side by side, zoomed into a brick wall at 500% to show you which camera, retains better detail or sharpness. And no offense to any of those reviews out there, but for me, I've never really found that ultra helpful, mainly because when do I ever zoom into 500% in a real world situation? So I wanted to do something that is common, so we just went to a park. And so I'm going to show you both cameras shot side by side. I'm not going to tell you which one is which. If you want to leave a guess, comment down below. I will leave the result in the description box, but let's see what we got. Okay, so the 4K video I think is really similar in both cameras. I think the Sony has a touch better of dynamic range, at least in those two clips. But in terms of detail and just overall image quality, I don't think you can tell that much of a difference between the two cameras. The one thing I'm sure you probably could tell was the colors were different from each camera. I think color science is a bit of a preference for people. There's no correct answer whether or not one is better than the other. A lot of Sony shooters will, kind of scoff at color science and say that it does not exist, whereas a lot of Canon shooters will, they will live and die on the altar of color science. So it's kind of funny to see that work out. For me personally, I think I do just overall enjoy the color of Canon more. It seems like with at least the Sony A7 III, there's a bit of this like yellowish, greenish hue in it, and it's not a big deal. It's fairly easy to correct that, but straight out of camera, I think the Canon does look a little bit better. But in terms of 4K quality, I think this one is a tie. You might think differently, so if you do, let me know down below. But moving on to 1080, I wanted to do a slow motion test because for me, I do shoot mostly in 4K. I rarely ever shoot in 1080, and when I do, it's slow motion most of the time. So I'm gonna do the same exact test, two clips side by side. This one will be a lot easier to tell the difference because for the Sony, we are going to shoot in 120 frames per second at 1080, where unfortunately with the Canon, we're only going to be able to do that at 60 frames per second. Now you can shoot in 120 frames per second at 720 with the EOS R, but unfortunately you lose the ability to have autofocus. And just the fact of shooting in 720, I think that's pretty ancient. I don't know if anybody's shooting in 720 these days. So we're going to do 1080, 120 frames per second versus 1080, 60 frames per second. We're just gonna check out the quality and which image you prefer more. Okay, so yeah, like I said, it's pretty easy to tell which one is which. The Sony obviously is much slower, slow motion. Now, I think a lot of people give Sony a hard time for its 120 frames per second. I personally am one of those people who is, a bit frustrated with it. But I think here's the reality. Sony gives you the ability to shoot at 120 frames per second where Canon does not. Is Sony's 120 the best in the world? Is it like 1DX Mark II status? No, definitely not. There are a lot of other cameras that shoot better 120. However, the fact that the Sony does offer it, I think is a big deal. There's nothing wrong with the Canon shooting at 60 frames per second. I think that image looks really good. It is, of course, more than usable. But when you see it side by side, 60 frames per second just doesn't look as good. That 120 just has that look to it, which I really, really enjoy. So for the 1080 quality, yeah, I'm gonna give the edge to Sony in this one. Once again, is it the biggest deal in the world that Canon doesn't have 120 at 1080? No. But when we're comparing them side by side, I think Sony is the winner for this round. All right, moving on to assistive features. Now, when I say assistive features, what I mean specifically are, what does this camera offer that makes shooting easier, more enjoyable, and overall just a bigger help for you as a filmmaker? Now, I think if you look just straight off the spec sheet, Sony really just blows away Canon in so many different areas. However, when we are talking practical terms, I think the Canon does hold its own in some ways. The first thing is that it has a flip out screen. I know not everybody cares about a flip out screen, but it is nice. Even if you're not turning it around to film yourself, just the ability to take it off of the camera body a little bit and have it out there slightly to the left, I have found that really helpful, whether I'm shooting photos or mostly shooting video. Sony does have a slightly articulating screen, but it doesn't have much of a range of motion, and I hardly ever use it off of its default position. Not to mention the flip out screen, the overall LCD screen itself is much better on the Canon. It has amazing touch features. You can not only touch to focus, but you can scroll through the menu and select your options with the touch screen, where unfortunately, Sony, you're not able to do that. You can touch to focus, although it's not quite as easy and intuitive as the Canon is, but you can at least touch to focus on the Sony, but that's it. You cannot navigate the menu system or do anything other than tap to focus on the Sony screen. So for that, yeah, Canon definitely has a much better screen and electronic viewfinder as well, although they're relatively close on that. And the last feature that I wanted to talk about really quickly, I actually made an entire video on this, and I'll link that right here, is the Sony A7iii's ability to internally record proxy files. So if you're new to this, what that means is that when you're shooting at 4K, a lot of times those files are kind of difficult to work with in post unless you have a really, really nice video editing computer. When you proxy record, your camera will not only shoot the 4K file, but it'll simultaneously shoot a 720 file. And so when you're editing with whatever software you're using, you can actually swap those files out and be editing the 720 image, which is going to be much smoother and easier to do in post-production. And then once you export the video, depending on which editor you're using, it'll automatically swap back in the 4K file, making editing really, really easy and saving you hours of time if you make proxy files through the editing software. All right, moving on to the last round of comparison, I want to talk about who are these cameras for. I think ultimately this is the most important thing that we ask ourselves and try and figure out. So let's start with the Canon EOS R. This camera is for anybody who has the money to spend on something like this. And I'm somewhat teasing when I say that, but not really, because this camera is starting off just the body only at $2,300. And then if you want the adapter ring to be able to mount your other EF lenses, you're looking at another $200. So just to get off the ground and running, you're gonna be spending $2,500 on this camera. And for me personally, that might be the biggest reason why I'm actually going to be returning it, because I just don't think I'm getting the proper value for that much money that I'm spending. Now, if you have the money, great. by all means go for it. And if you are somebody who loves Canon products, or you're just heavily invested into the Canon ecosystem and you're looking for an upgrade into full frame for the first time, or maybe you have something like the original 6D and it's time to make a change, then yeah, this camera I think would suit you very well. Now for the Sony, I think this camera is going to be great for wedding shooters, both photo and video. It has 2 card slots. It has fantastic battery life. This camera is going to be a really good option for you. And lastly, one thing I wanted to say before we end this video is that if this is your first camera, if you are considering either one of these, the Canon or the Sony, for your first ever camera, I would say that these cameras are not for you. $2,000, in my opinion, is too much money to spend on your first ever DSLR or mirrorless camera. Now, I started on a camera that was less than $500, the Canon SL2. And I think a lot of people, give it a hard time, or just give, cheaper cameras a hard time for the lack of features that they hold. And it's true, the Canon SL2 was incredibly feature-less. But can I tell you that, to be honest, I think the lack of features really helped me grow as a photographer and as a videographer, because it forced me to get creative. It forced me to develop my skill and my talent and not rely on the camera to do the job for me. So if this is your first camera that you're looking at, I would highly advise checking something out for either Canon or Sony or any other model for that matter. Something that's less than $1,000. Hone in your craft, get better first. Don't try and rely on a camera to make you a better creator, because it's just not gonna happen. So anyways, yeah, that's it. That is the Sony versus Canon debate for me. I think I'm gonna stick with the Sony for now and just wait to see what happens in the near future with, the future cameras coming out, and hopefully we'll get some upgrades here shortly. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate you spending your time and just allowing me to share what I've learned in this video. If you have anything to say, if you have any feedback, I'd love to hear from you down in the comments down below. But until next time, I hope you have a great week, a great day, and I will see you in the next video.